Now get ready, because it's time to bear down. Welcome back, Bears fans, to another episode of the Chicago Audible. I'm your host, Will DeWitt, and it's been the first week of Chicago Bears training camp, I would say, in its early iteration of it. Joining with me is my co-host, Nicholas Moriano. And Nick, I don't know if you can tell in my voice, but it's pretty early. I can't remember the last time I actually had a podcast recording with you drinking coffee, because usually we do record in the evenings, but how have you been? How's the Brady Bunch? And just curious of what's been new over this last about week. Just about a week.
Yeah, so it has been a while since we recorded in the morning. It's a different setting, but again, exciting. We're talking Bears football, but in terms of things that are new, hopefully, and look, I'm going to jinx myself right now, Will, but I tried to get the right equipment to make the internet work better, the popping hopefully go away in the microphone. A lot of things have, I guess, changed there, so hopefully that transpires in this podcast. And Brady, like we were just talking earlier, he really loves to chew on my Nike slides. So if you ever have old slides that you don't want, Brady, my puppy, will love them.
Well, there we go. Donate those to Nicholas Moriano. But Nick, do you remember yet the last time we did record this early in the morning?
No, I have no idea. Maybe like sometime in training camp, but I don't know this early, because training camp would be over around around noonish. We would probably record after those days, but this early. Oh, was it sometime in Indianapolis maybe, or no?
No, I thought you were going to have it.
Too.
2018, the morning after the Hall of Fame game. You, me, and Brandon in the hotel room.
Ed Will.
Was he there for the Hall of Fame game?
Right?
I thought he came later, and it was only for the Urlacher enshrinement. No,
oh, maybe that's what. I don't even remember, but yes, I do remember doing that. We were all like on our beds. We had our, microphones hooked up, recording, and in the hotel room. That was a good time.
We're all a little hungover. I mean, it was a pretty good time. All right, but obviously we have some training camp stuff to talk about, and without any access inside. We're here resharing what we've heard, what we've seen throughout all the reporting, what the Bears have been able to provide as well, just because we know you listening at home, most of you depend on us to get some of this news, some of this knowledge, and we want to make sure that you don't miss anything as we kind of go through what I called in the last podcast a very dark type of training camp, where we're going to be a lot more behind the shadows than in years past. But Nick, so far your internet seems to be working well. Fingers crossed. I know we've gone through a few extra headaches over the last day and a half to try to get those ironed out. We were supposed to record yesterday evening. Didn't work out, but I think we're okay to go. So you want to kind of begin the show?
Let's do it.
All right. So I think we should start with the most important item here, and it's the most recent, at least for us here, and that's going to be Mitchell Trubisky as well as Nick Foles speaking with the media here for the first time at Halas Hall to kind of kick off training camp. And let's start with Mitch, just because he spoke first, and I think the biggest takeaway is that he says that he just wants to prove every day that he is the number one guy for this team, and on top of that, that he just has all the motivation in the world to prove the doubters wrong. I think he said it lights a fire under him to kind of hear some of this negativity, some of the doubters, that he's incapable of becoming the franchise quarterback for the Chicago Bears. Nick, obviously, I think that's what I expected Mitch to say coming in. If he came in with a lesser mindset than that, I would have had that probably as a red flag. How about you? Anything you want to mention about Mitchell Trubisky and his mindset heading into camp? It seems like it's where it should be.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there, Will, just being that he wants to take advantage of each practice, each day, and kind of prove, like you said, his doubters wrong that are writing him off. That's, I think one of the reporters asked him, there are guys that are writing you off. How does that kind of impact you? And that was his response, and I think that's a very predictable one, right? You want to be motivated and want to prove these people wrong. But yeah, I think the mindset's always really been there for Mitch, and we're seeing that he's saying all the right things. He usually does. But yeah, I think that's exactly how you have to have the kind of mindset like this, especially when Nick Foles is in the building now. He's been in the building for 3 days, so you have to have this mindset to want to take advantage of every day, every rep, every practice to kind of prove to the coaches that he still can be the number one guy for this team.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Nick. Nick Moriano. Every time I say Nick, when I think about Nick Foles now, I get a little confused in my own head, which that could be troublesome this season for the podcast. But the other big item that Mitch talked about that people have been discussing over the last, I was going to say day, but it's only been like 12, 15 hours. But it's that Mitch has worked on his mechanics a little bit. And he mentioned this is the first time he's actually changed his overall mechanics in the pocket, his throwing motion, and the first time in his career, which is interesting to me because you would think you would have had to adjust it. It's never been great. We've talked about that ever since the Bears drafted him in 2017, that that's something he needs to work on. So I guess it makes sense that if it was still so poor in the past, that's probably why, if he hasn't really worked on it. But are you as confused as I am by that? Because you would have thought he would have worked on it in the past, but as the same token, if it is the first time and he's actually worked hard at it, I am a little excited to see what results it could yield.
Yeah, it's interesting that hasn't been maybe touched on in the past. I felt like I've read reports, though, that someone's been working with his mechanics because obviously they have been issues. The footwork's been issues. And if Dave Ragone, who's, was been with Mitch for the entire Bears career, hasn't really looked at that, and now it takes an outside quarterback coach to kind of fix those or adjust those mechanics, that's a little strange. But look, I think the more positive thing here is that it is happening. He is adjusting his arm throw, his ankles, how he's holding the ball, releasing the football, just working on the balance in the pocket, he was also saying. So yes, those are positive. It's good that he's working on those things, and we want to see how that actually relates and translates to the football field. But it's just interesting in itself that it wasn't touched on maybe earlier. But again, maybe he just forgot that he may have worked on something like a little tweak because it's not that big of an issue for him. Because even when he answered the question, it's like, oh, I don't want to get into like the in-depths about it. He just kind of, those were the things he said that were adjusted. But it is interesting in itself.
For sure. And then the good news is it really hit on a lot of the items during the last episode that we had, the Countdown to Camp for the quarterback preview, that we wanted him to work on. So obviously I think he's saying the right things. He's putting in the work. And speaking of putting in the work, you did hear, at least from Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy, about the trainers, the strength and conditioning coaches that the Bears have. And they just kind of came over to the front office for the Bears and just like expressing how impressed they were to work with Mitch. And just the work that Mitch put in this offseason, like you can tell that he's been training hard. You and I were talking about the photos that the Bears released of some of their walkthroughs, and Mitch looks like a little bit more tapered, a little bit more lean, and I'm excited. I mean, obviously, he's putting in the mental work to be a leader still. He's putting in the extra grind work when it comes to changing those body habits with the mechanics, and of course, with that shoulder coming off that injury, the fact he's able to continue to train his whole body this offseason to get himself in probably the best shape that I've seen him at this point of the year, all of those things are really positive for him as we kind of kick off this quarterback competition. Were you as excited as I'm sure a lot of Bears fans were about hearing about Mitch's work ethic, seeing some of, seeing the photos of the trimmed out Mitch, but I don't want to go too far here.
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, my takeaway is seeing that photo. Mitch looked good. He did. He looked, like you said, a little bit slimmer, looked like he was just solid. And he credited a lot of the work they did in the offseason to Spear Training, which is a facility in Vernon Hills, and that's where he's been working out throughout the offseason. He said it was just a safe environment to work in. So he was able to put in that work to kind of change his body, change the mechanics. And you mentioned that shoulder, the rehab that he had to go through. He also said in that Zoom interview yesterday that he feels 100% from that. Again, credit Spear Training for doing that. But he also said, just during last season, there was a lot of pain. There was pain that he was just playing through as he was kind of doing this. And he just, it's unfortunate. That's what the situation was. But he feels 100% now. He looks good. hopefully look good, feel good, right, Will? So maybe that could, with the mechanics, hopefully improve. Now you have the other quarterback here. Guys are starting to be in camp. They've been also talking, Mitch saying that this is what yesterday was his third day doing walkthroughs with the rookies, which I think is, a great seeing that the quarterbacks there are helping out a lot of these guys that didn't have the OTAs. Obviously, a regular training camp are not going to have as many opportunities, practice reps. So that's great. You're seeing Mitch look the part. Now he just has to actually be, the quarterback that we all want him to be.
Yeah, and that's, of course, a much tougher task. But, yeah, you hit on it. And a fun fact for people listening, or I guess a spoiler alert, depending how you want to look at it. But coming up, or maybe I should just set the expectation for you. We do have a segment with Mason West, which I'm sure you've heard his name before. He's had plenty of shout-outs. He is a physical therapist, and we have a segment that I talked to him earlier this week. And one of the talking points was about Mitch, about his injury, about his rehab, the impacts this season. But also I did have a question about last season and how wearing a harness, playing with a shoulder with that torn labrum, how that can really affect just overall mechanics, because he does have that arm strapped down to his side a little bit more, and just how the impact that could have across his whole body, the trickle-down effect. So definitely stay tuned for that, because I think you would really find that information insightful. But, Nick, is there anything else on Mitchell Trubisky before we move on to Mr. Foles?
You know what? I think just the last thing here on Mitchell Trubisky, I think it was Patrick Finley, my old professor, asked him, obviously there's been discussions about him trying to get away from football. It's always football, football, football with Mitch, but how does he get away? And just three things that he kind of said, what he did this past offseason. He said he played a lot of golf, hung out with his girlfriend, and then the times he could and was able to hang out with family and friends, he did that and just kind of enjoyed the moment. And I think, look, he's human just like all of us, and I think as a quarterback, you're always maybe tasked with being the hardest worker in the room, but it's nice to see that he was able to kind of get away, and now he's back, and we know that Mitch is a hard worker, but those are just some of the things that Mitch was doing in terms of the offseason to get away from football.
That's a great question from Finley, because that jogged my memory of, I think it was around the Combine when Matt Nagy was talking about Mitchell Trubisky, and he wanted him to get away. He's like, dude, you're working too hard. You're just too micro-focused on all these things, and you do need that mental break. And so I'm glad that was a really good follow-up to kind of take what we heard earlier this offseason and tie it in now as we kind of kick off training camp. So I'm glad that I missed that one. I didn't have it in my notes, but I'm glad to hear it, because he did follow through and listen to Coach, which is also probably wise for him as he's vying for this starting job. But let's go ahead and move on to Nick Foles. I don't think he talked nearly as long, but the biggest news that we got out of Nick Foles is that rumor that kind of circulated earlier this week about him potentially opting out of the season. We do have an official opt-out and Eddie Goldman to talk about here in a minute. But Nick Foles, it was rumored that he was going to opt out this season. He just had a newborn child, but he said there's just no truth to it. He's never really even spoke about it. The option was never on the table. He wants to be in Chicago. He wants to play football this year. And so, obviously, I don't think we need to, hit on a rumor that it was just set in its place, Nick. But were you as glad as I was to at least hear that?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, when you see those kind of things circulating on Twitter, you try to find, who's saying this, and then you see that it's just not an unverified account. But I'm glad that it was just a rumor. That's all it was. There was never a discussion about opting out, like you said, Will. But I think a big part in what Nick Foles kind of touched on was just what the Bears had in place, the facility, just the game plan that they have of what they're going to do with this COVID-19 pandemic that we're all dealing with, how they're going to handle that. That played a big part into Nick Foles and his family just feeling comfortable that they're going to be able to, I guess, just manage this situation and make it, the best that they can. So I think that played a big part in it. It's really nice that the Bears upgraded their facility, last year or 2 years ago now, or started doing that, because it's really helping out this entire situation right now.
Yeah, it really is, and we'll talk about the Bears' COVID plan, some of the adjustments that they made here in the show as well, Nick. But yeah, I mean, it's great that they've done it, and for Nick Foles, the fact that the Bears have been able to build a facility, put a plan in place that are making players comfortable, I mean, that's good for this season. But even when you're looking at future free agency classes, to have such a state-of-the-art facility that you can kind of boast and tout a little bit, it's just gonna help. It's not gonna hurt. Now, of course, is it gonna be the end-all be-all for a winning season? No, but you could maybe secure a free agent that maybe was on the fence just due to it. I mean, you have to show him off the perks, so that's always exciting as well. But getting back to Nick Foles, of course, he's in this battle as well, and he mentioned that in order to win it, all he needs to do is just be himself, which, hey, be you, Matt Nagy. I caught that one. He's already catching on to coach speak over here. And just focus on the needs to be really internal. He doesn't need to focus on Mitch. He doesn't need to focus on some of the external factors. He needs to focus on himself and just do, I think he said, the little things right every single day, which from Nick Foles has been around the league as long as he has. That was the professional answer that he had all offseason to kind of think through and prepare for, and that's really all I have on Foles, unless you have some more that you think our listeners would definitely benefit from hearing, just in case they did miss his interview.
Yeah, so I think obviously, the big thing, like you were just mentioning, Will, how to win the competition, and he said you just focus on not winning it, just being yourself and just kind of doing the little things every single day, and everything will kind of play out in itself. But he also talked about just why this fit was good for Chicago. He said there's a lot of similar verbiage between this Bears offense and the Philadelphia offense that he was with just a couple years ago. And I think the big thing, too, that he kept on saying throughout the interview, and I'm like, man, Nick Foles, you could just buy into this guy. It's just he didn't want to focus on, again, this competition. It's like, just go out there and play ball. And that's something that he reiterated multiple times throughout that Zoom interview. And another thing that I really liked from him, obviously this competition, it's Mitch and Nick Foles for this one starting position, but he said he's not going to keep any secrets. If there's a play that he's run multiple times in the Philly offense that's very similar to this one, he said he's going to help out Mitch. He's going to help out Tyler Bray. They're going to do it interchangeably, and he just wants to do what's best for the team. If that's taking the second team, third team reps, or first team, he's just going to do it to the best of his ability. And also, he also said with this competition, let's say Mitch, or he kind of did a hypothetical, like if one guy makes a big play, he said he can't focus on just trying to match a big play for a big play. If there's a check down, but that's the right play that's the right route or the right read to go into play, he's going to do that. So he's not worried about trying to match, quote unquote, what the other quarterback is doing. Just, again, be himself and just play ball. That was the big thing that Nick Foles was talking about. And I think that the best thing for Mitch to happen is Nick Foles, because he's going to get the best out of him. If he takes his job, that so be it. But Mitch is going to be a better quarterback because Nick Foles is in this quarterback competition.
I think Nick Foles is just another fire underneath Mitchell Trubisky's rear end right now. Just like he talked about with the motivation for the doubters, Nick Foles is an equal offline recordings, Nick. You always let the word space, but he's a
motivator.
Yeah, motivator, exactly. There we go. Thank you. You're pulling out the dictionary for me, which I needed it. I got to get a second cup of coffee after this recording. But, yeah, it's another motivator for Mitch, which anytime you have someone as young as Mitch is, we know the potential. And, again, keywords potential that we've seen. This could be a good way to start tapping into it a little bit more and just changing Mitch's mindset, motivating him, and getting him a little bit more hungry for success, which I don't think that's even a question about Mitch. I think he's extremely hungry to succeed here in Chicago specifically as well. But is there anything else on the quarterback competition or the quarterbacks in general before we kind of move on to another big topic that we need to hit on that came out this week?
I think the only last thing I want to hit on, and this actually came in the Hogan Johns podcast. One of them asked Ryan Pace about the quarterback situation, but they were just kind of saying that all three of them, Tyler Bray, Nick Foles, Mitchell Trubisky, they all just know this offense really, really well. And I kind of looked at, when I heard that, does Mitch know the offense really, really well? Because obviously that wasn't the case last year, but just helping out the rookies, every single one of them, just explain the nuances of what the particular player should do in a certain situation, the nuances of how you should run a route, all these things. But it was just great to hear that, again, these veterans are actually here at training camp helping out these rookies in that they're trying to just get them acclimated to the NFL game.
Yeah. When you're talking about the Hogan Johns podcast and you said one of them asked, you could have just said Adam and no one would have known that you were.
True. Very true.
Just wanted to throw that one out there. You could have just said Adam and you would have been fine. Oh, no, but you make a really good point there as well. And I do think Mitch knows the offense. I think he understands what the concepts are, but I think the problem is when he's in play and there's pressure in his face and he has to make those quick decisions. That's where I think it falls apart. It's kind of like a student who's smart and has done all the homework, does the homework well, prepares for the test, but they're just not a good test taker. Like that's a thing. And
good analogy.
And hopefully that's something that Mitch can get over this year. But I do think more than likely that's the case. He's just not a good test taker. And in the NFL, it's all about tests.
One last thing, Will, too, with like Mitch, with in his Zoom interview, he did someone asked him about going back and watching all the tape, the coverages and stuff, and he says he feels a lot better in terms of diagnosing coverages. But he also said that all of his mistakes, all the bad ones, are correctable. And I think when you really look at some of the things that Mitch has done wrong, just missing a receiver, not planting his foot, or maybe looking where he should have been, I kind of buy into that a little bit. Because if he just hits the wide open receiver, look, that's a correctable mistake. He maybe read it right, just threw a bad ball. Or if he's looking one way and really the progression's right there, like these are correctable mistakes if you know exactly what's going on, if you can become a better test taker, like you were just kind of mentioning there, Will. So I thought that was also, we have to see it on the field, but I'm glad that it was brought up that he feels that way right now, and then we'll just have to wait and see come game day. Obviously, no preseason games, you can't see it earlier, but during the regular season, well, hopefully that kind of plays out on the field.
Yeah, and I was going to mention NBA because I was watching some of it, the restart yesterday. I'm like, there's no defense. And I was wondering about the NFL. Like, is it going to be like a Pro Bowl game as well? Like, are we going to not have defense? And that's what it started feeling like yesterday. And I'm curious to see how that's going to translate. But for Mitch specifically, Nick, one final thing. And anytime we talk quarterbacks, and we didn't talk about quarterbacks for months because of how we did our countdown to camp. So maybe why we're harping on it a little bit. But just listen to him speak. Listen to what I'm hearing about him. I get more excited about Mitch in terms of like my hope for him. Like I hope Mitch can turn out to be the guy. I hope he can turn it around. I hope he can win this quarterback competition, and I hope it brings out the best of him. Like I think Nick Foles is a good insurance policy, but I think we talked about this in the last episode too. And I think we're just more on the fence because we just haven't seen or heard from Mitch in such a long time. And you see the film last year, and it wasn't good. But just when you hear what he's saying and you hear the work he's putting in and you remember that he is our second overall pick and he's only entering his fourth year in the league, you just hope he can put the pieces together, because if he can, it could be a home run for the Bears. There's still that potential. It could happen. And now is it likely? That's murky. That's where some of the concerning comes in. But it's sports. You've seen more out of the ordinary things happen. And if the Bears could hit this home run still, I mean, Ryan Pace, from the speculation of the hot seat or not hot seat, that would make his seat freezing cold. Like he could be sitting there for all of eternity if he can get the Bears a franchise guy at quarterback. So anything else?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's just that connection, right? Obviously, when you see the Bears move up to get a quarterback, and it's just seeing that he's a really good guy. It's easy to root for Mitchell Trubisky. It really is. But we just want to see him have success, and if everything he's done in the offseason actually equates to that, there's no reason why anybody should root against him. I don't think anyone is rooting against Mitch. Maybe he's not. Maybe if it all plays out, he's just not the best option. Then that's the case. But I don't think that anyone really wants to root against the guy, because he is someone that they moved up for. This is someone that they wanted. Yes, you would have liked the other two quarterbacks that went, after him, but it's somebody that you can easily get behind, hope for the best, and just hopefully his career just kind of takes a turn here. We'll just, again, like I've been saying a couple of times now, we'll have to wait and see.
Wait and see. We can speculate all we want, Nick, but it's probably not going to help anyone any further on this show. So let's move into a big issue, and that is the Bears' nose tackle situation. This is twofold. First, it broke that Eddie Goldman, he's opting out of the season just due to COVID concerns, which, if he is that concerned, I'll admit, and I'll just say it right here, I'm proud of him to stand by his principles. I'm proud that he was able to take that stand, take a huge pay cut for the season to protect his family. If he felt that's the right thing to do, I mean, that's a really just It's a strong move. It's a confident one, and it's one that just takes a lot of guts to make, as well as, like I said, you have to be very in line with your principles, and you put some other like financial or personal goals aside for the greater good of the ones that you care for the most. So for Eddie Goldman to do that, as much as it really sucks from a defensive standpoint, and for the Bears in the general, I get it, and I'm not going to ever hold it against him. Like, I'm not going to be here in 2021 like, if we had Eddie Goldman out there, whatever could have happened. I'm not going to ever get to that point. So Eddie Goldman, you're always going to be in my good graces as well. And then secondarily, John Jenkins, he's on the COVID list right now. And Nick, as you tweeted, doesn't mean he has COVID. He could have just been around someone that was tested positive, so the Bears had to be a little bit ultra cautious. But to lose Eddie Goldman for the season, and now John Jenkins, who's the other nose tackle type of build, it leaves a really big hole in the middle of this Bears defense. Now, I've seen things about moving Akeem Hicks maybe inside, moving Bilal Nichols maybe inside. But as it currently stands, do you have concerns about the depth at nose tackle? Because I remember on our defensive line podcast, we were just gushing about how deep that this position is, and maybe one of the deepest on the team. And that's getting tested real quick. And now I don't think I stand by what I said a month ago, just because, I mean, you lose Eddie Goldman, who's your only pure nose tackle. I mean, that changes your entire scheme, which is concerning because of the smaller inside linebackers who do need someone to eat those double teams, block up those A gaps. I just get real concerned real quick losing Eddie Goldman, and I'm sure the Bears can find a way to mitigate the damage. But as it sits right now, this is a tough pill to swallow for me, Nick. How about you?
Yeah, it's definitely tough when you lose your nose and then your backup nose tackle. So there really isn't a true nose tackle on this Bears roster that can go right now. If the season were to start tomorrow, say here we're going to plug it in, the Bears don't really have one. But the good thing about this Bears defense and how they can kind of manage this, look, they'll get John Jenkins back at some point. And just to quickly talk about Eddie Goldman, completely respect his decision. It seems like a lot of the heavier kind of players are opting out. That just seems to be the situation with respiratory issues that can happen with COVID-19. It just seems like that's the way that a lot of players are going. I think 3 defensive tackles in the NFC North alone have opted out. So that just seems to be the situation at hand. But what the Bears do, or what Chuck Pagano did a lot last season, you saw where there were only 2 defensive linemen on the field at times. And Roy Roberson Harris actually had more snaps than Eddie Goldman. So, yes, I think it's definitely going to hurt the run game, the run defense, for sure. Not having Eddie Goldman, who is known for that, and really that gets overlooked in his game just because not a lot of people talk about Eddie Goldman. But the Bears kind of play this defense, a lot of nickel packages where they're taking out that third defensive lineman usually and going with a Roy Roberson Harris and, if healthy, an Akeem Hicks. So you could still manage, and obviously having a Bilal Nichols to supplement and just put in there as well is going to help. It's not an easy fix, but I think the Bears can work around not having Eddie Goldman. And like I said, John Jenkins should return. We just, again, wait and see what's happening there, whether he did actually test positive or he just was around people that test positive. But there are ways to work around it. Their depth is definitely not where we had it, a couple weeks ago or whenever we did the defensive line Countdown to Camp podcast. It definitely hurts, but the Bears can work around it. You're not going to get better as a defense taking away Eddie Goldman, but there are ways to adjust your game. And that's what everyone's doing. Everyone's adjusting, where everyone's going to lose players at some point, I think, with COVID-19. But I think the Bears will be okay. They'll still have a very dominant defense. Like I said, the run game's going to take a blow, and also just having, if you have to go those sub packages all the time, become a little bit more predictable. If you're going to be, teams play nickel package almost 70% of the time, even more than that. But it would be nice to kind of just go your base 3-4 every now and then and have your best options there. Bears won't have that because Eddie Goldman won't be here.
Right. Like you said, there are other options. I do think, and again, we'll find out this season how much worse they are, but I do think the Bears, there's no way you can say they're going to be just as well or fine. They're going to be, for lack of a better term, worse. I'm going to use that term here, but again, it could just be a slight dip in production in terms of their running defense, which again has been so stout over the last 2 seasons, largely due to Eddie Goldman and his ability to stuff the run, get some of that initial penetration to backfield, hold down his point on those blocks, not get pushed around on double teams. We just have to find a big guy to do it there, and I'm sure we can find someone like a John Jenkins to step in and be fine. But again, there's a difference of being fine and being someone better, which is the Eddie Goldman route. But anything else you wanted to hit about the Bears losing their nose?
The only thing, going back to the Hogan Johns podcast, and one of the Adams asked about Damon Snacks Harrison as being a possible replacement there. They asked Ryan Pace that. Of course, Ryan Pace is not going to give any valuable information, but it seemed like just with his answer that there are options that they are looking at right now. And not just at the defensive tackle position, nose tackle position, but also other positions as well. And they're going to wait and see because obviously they have to cut down. A lot of teams have to make the 80. I think that's maybe one other thing that we should talk about. But the Bears do plan on tomorrow being down to 80 players. So there will be cuts maybe the next few hours, maybe by tomorrow morning, whatever it may be. But it seemed like Pace is adamant about adding somebody else. So look for that transaction to possibly happen, maybe after the cut downs happen. But in terms of the nose tackle position, yeah, the Bears need people. They need bodies there because they just don't have any right now.
It's crazy how quickly the situation can flip on a dime. We were just like, so much depth, so much. And now we're like, you lose one guy. And you're like, ooh, like it has you sweating just a little bit thinking about the potential impact, which, again, maybe, and this is not ideal, but this could be the year, or I think it will be a year where you're really going to miss Eddie Goldman. And I think fans that maybe overlook that position, overlook Eddie Goldman, I think that'll change. I think the narrative, they'll understand the value and the importance that he brings to the table week in and week out. Nick, the other bigger news player-wise was Trey Roberson this week. The CFL standout cornerback that the Bears brought in on the biggest contract from the CFL to the NFL since Cameron Wake. Ended up breaking his foot or injuring his foot. I think it's probably a break, but over the offseason when he was doing some training. This got disclosed now, so they released him. He cleared waivers, and now he's on the Bears' non-injury list. So obviously they liked him enough to keep him around. And I know Pace was kind of mentioning, he was someone that we scouted heavily in the CFL that we're really high on and we're excited about. Now, he can say that, but we also drafted Jalen Johnson. We also brought in Artie Burns. So I know we've had plenty of options. We talked about it all offseason. And now I don't think the Trey Roberson injury is going to totally impact the Bears' plans. We talked about this a little bit on that cornerback preview show, but it's a little unfortunate because this is one less body to be competing with a Kevin Tolliver, with the Burns, and Jalen Johnson, who's a little bit behind the eight ball because he's just now going through walkthroughs in this defense. Are you disappointed as well that Roberson's not going to be a part of this battle at cornerback because we were trying to get the best guys, and he could have been better than a Burns. He could have been right on par or better than a Kevin Tolliver, but unfortunately, he's going to be sitting on a non-injury just kind of pup list.
Yeah, I think you have to be a little disappointed because remember when the signing happened, it was I think the biggest or the second biggest CFL contract to ever happen, right? So, and a lot of teams were vying to try to get a Trey Roberson, and it's unfortunate that we won't get to see that, at least this season. But what that does do, and yes, there is less competition, it does just give more reps to all the other guys and who are not getting as many reps because of everything going on. So there's positives, there's negatives, and just the Bears wanting to work with Trey Roberson. That's what Pace said. They want to work with him throughout this kind of situation that he's in. I think shows what the Bears kind of think about him and what they want to still see from him, even though they can't do that right now. But I think with Trey Roberson, again, I'm going to say it again. I don't know why I keep doing this. Wait and see, because I think he'll be somebody that is in the mix of things later on. Obviously, you can't really do much with a broken foot. It's unfortunate, but the Bears still have, I think, there's still a future for him here. Now, I don't know what the ceiling is with that, but there's still something that Trey Roberson can gain from the Bears organization.
Yeah, I believe so as well. Again, how big of a role that is, I don't know. Maybe you're just a primary backup who has a really strong special teams presence. Great, we need guys like that. I mean, every team needs players like that, but unfortunately, we're not going to know, and he could have surprised folks this year. You don't know. He could have been pushing Jalen Johnson to, just because, I mean, they're both new to the team. They're both new to the defense, but one's been around professional football or one's coming from the collegiate level, which again, CFL is not the NFL, but it's still, from college, it's a step up. So it would be interesting to see, like you said, later on what Trey Roberson, if he can take this setback, overcome it, and still find himself in a firm spot here in the Chicago Bears organization. But one final talking point before I want to get to our segment with Mason West here in a little bit. But before we do, I do want to talk about the Bears' COVID plan, just because it was something that they took some time to explain to fans what they're doing. They came out with some videos. They've written articles on it. The Bears are trying to let everyone know what they're doing, and I believe it's because, like Pace mentioned, the Bears believe that they have the best setup in the NFL in terms of how they are handling COVID-19. There's a lot that they're doing. A lot of it, like you mentioned, Nick, comes to the fact that Halas Hall is just renovated. They've added more to it for training camp, and now all of this extra space, you're going to be able to use it to keep people distant, to have a huge weight room, be able to split guys into groups, and to split it off in a way where they're going to be able to keep things segmented, keep people away from one another. And the Bears are just taking the NFL's precautions that they've mandated on teams and are taking it to that next level to keep things even more safe, like having players check their temperature twice at home before leaving. I wonder if they have to all use like the same type of thermometer too, that way it's consistent. Just a thought. I didn't say anything like that, but one brand versus another brand, or an electronic versus like an infrared, like you can have so many different types of readings. So you have to think there has to be some consistency there, but on top of that, the scanning the temperature thing's pretty cool. Like when you're walking into the door, you have to stand in front. And by cool, I mean it's unique.
State of the art.
Yeah, it is. It's futuristic in a way, and on top of that too, just everyone having to wear like a tracker so they know who you've been around. So if you've touched points with someone else, then they can kind of watch. I'm going to use the word spread of just touch points, but not spread of COVID. That way people know I'm clear. Just who was with who, and then the branches that it kind of follows from there, which will be real interesting data, but will help them, if there's a positive test, to know who to quarantine, who to distance, and who to test to make sure they can make sure that people aren't infected earlier. But that's just a couple super high-level items. I didn't want to take them all for you, Nick. What are some other pieces of the Bears' COVID plan that you kind of found interesting? I'm not going to say because I don't think anyone likes having to have a COVID plan, but that you find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go on the Chicago Bears website and just look at the COVID-19 safety measures they have there, you look at the Walter Payton Center, it looks a lot different than if you've ever been there before. I've seen photos of it. There's just desks that are spaced out on this 100-yard football field, indoor football field. Each one has the player's number on them, the name, so then all these guys have a consistent kind of station to go to, and they also have the workout area in there too, and that's also because of the new renovations that were done at Halas Hall. The Bears can have, I think what it is 2 groups of 15 that can work out at the same time. So they have one in the Walter Payton Center, and then they have their original workout center at Halas Hall. So that's also a nice adjustment. And actually, my girlfriend and I were driving from Bears Fit, and we just wanted to take a drive by Halas Hall as close as we can actually get to it. But because of the renovations, they do have a bigger parking lot, and in one of those parking lots is a testing center. So all these adjustments, these enhancements, these additions to Halas Hall have just prepared the Bears to be, I guess, in the best position to kind of deal with all these things. I see you laughing over there, Will. What are you laughing at?
I'm just thinking like the Bears saying, hey, guys, sorry, but no credentials, no media emails, and you're just like sneaking by, like driving as close as you could possibly get to Halas Hall.
There are a couple buildings.
You're really yearning to get in there. Like you're jonesing for it. Like that's pretty fun. I just imagine you driving like, I'm going to get all the way as close as I possibly can because I can't get any closer, but you still took the opportunity. I know you live close, but just thinking about it to kind of put a smile on my face of you just getting as close as you can to Halas Hall, despite the fact the Bears said, stay away. You're like pushing the envelope a little bit, which good for you, man.
Yeah, there's an Abbott Labs that's over there. They have a roof. I can maybe I don't know,
get some knocks.
Company, like working on the roof, just get some, maybe a little drone or whatever. But no, yeah. So drove over there. They do have again that extra parking space which is used for COVID testing. But a lot of the things you mentioned, Will, I think are just great additions to try and help prevent the spread of COVID-19 amongst the entire team there. But I think the Bears are just doing it right. And I think that's why, again, Nick Foles felt comfortable being here. I think that's why a lot of the players who are there already feel comfortable with all the precautions the Bears are taking, because this is a very serious issue. No one's going to say that it's not, or hopefully, but the Bears are doing their due diligence to make safety their number one priority so that football can be played and can be played safely.
Yeah, really well said there, Nick. Still thinking about you flying that drone. You took that from training camp when I wanted to take a drone and fly it over the practice, but that's fun.
Did we say George McCaskey was going to come up with an RPG and just take it out or something like that? Or I think we had
we had a full creative exercise around what would happen if we flew a drone over a Bears practice, and yeah, I think McCaskey with an RPG was where we landed as the most likely scenario. Which, as many times as we met him, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, seriously.
He just, he'd that big buff security guard guy. He'd just give him the look, and he'd like toss him over that RPG, and there goes our drone of our live Bears coverage. But all right, I think that's it for Bears COVID plans. I don't have anything else that I want to mention. So up next, we are going to have Mason come on the show, talk to him about the impact of some key injuries like Roquan Smith, Mitchell Trubisky, even Nick Foles from last year, Danny Trevathan, Akeem Hicks, what their offseason may have looked like, some of the impact that their injuries can have on maybe other areas of their body this season, and just the likelihood of maybe getting re-injured. And on top of that, too, just talking to him just about some various items in terms of how the Bears are handling COVID, and from his physical therapy standpoint, what a limited offseason, no minicamp, no OTAs, can have an impact in terms of potential further injuries this season, and his thoughts about how the NFL are handling this ramp-up period for training camp and if it's enough or not. So stick around here for Mason. But Nick, before I let Mason on, because Mason, he reminds me of Shoutouts because he's someone that always helps support our show. Do you mind passing out? I think you said we have one shout-out to give this week, which I'm excited to give this person the shout-out that he or she deserves.
Yes, so we got one shout-out, and again, this was, a week ago now, but it's awesome that you guys are still doing this and we're still able to give these shout-outs. But I just want to say thank you so much to Michael Rosenberg from Aurora, Colorado for the generous donation. Thank you so much for that. But, of course, if you want to give or hear your name on the podcast next time, you could definitely do that by just giving us any kind of donation. It doesn't matter what amount it is. We'll give you a shout-out. Tell us where you're from, and we'll make ssure to address the shout-out accordingly. But on Venmo, you can look up at the Chicago Audible. You should see my name, and you should see the logo and my name on there. And then I'm blanking on what the PayPal exactly is. I think it's chicagoaudible.com/PayPal.
Yeah, it's that easy.
Would be the one on PayPal.
Yeah, it's that
easy. So those are the two ways you can send in your donations. But again, everybody that's sent in donations over the past months now, thank you so much. Will and I really appreciate that. It just shows that, again, you enjoy what we're doing and that we can give back to you guys in this small way of giving you a shout out on the podcast.
And on top of that too, just to let people know just like the impact that can have. Obviously every week we talk about it helps host the website. It helps host the monthly fees that we have for all the different tools that we do for the live recordings, the live shows that we do on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And on top of that, Nick, it helps offset some of the costs. Like you just had to go to Best Buy yesterday to get yourself a Ethernet to USB adapter as well as a USB port extender so you can plug in your microphone, your webcam, as well as your internet now. And this has been by far the best experience I've had with you going, at least from a technology standpoint, in a while. So it does help offset some of those more personal costs of upgrading equipment and just making sure that we're continuing to up our game. I have a lot of ideas for our future as well, but of course, one thing at a time, and I want to focus on this 2020 Chicago Bears season. But thank you so much for everyone who gave their donations over, like you just said, Nick, the last 2 months. It's so appreciated. It really does help us out with items like these. And also, when you mentioned Aurora, I really, Colorado is the last state that I had in mind. I really thought you were going to say Illinois. I was like, did you read that right? But you must have.
Yeah, and it's so funny, the word Aurora, because Adam Johns mentioned that in the podcast yesterday, and I think he meant to say aroma. of like the football field being back and a full. I don't know. It's just weird that we're mentioning this now again, and I was just talking about Aurora yesterday.
It's just that kind of a word. But all right. Let's get back to business, and let's go ahead and bring on Mason West, physical therapist from Team Rehabilitation in Barrington, Illinois. All right, Mason, I'm glad to have you. I know you've been a big-time listener of our show for quite some time now. You're always coming in through the support each and every week, which I love giving you a shout-out. Obviously, I'm glad to have your expertise on the show. We're going to talk about a couple of players that are coming off some really critical injuries with a limited offseason just due to the COVID year that we're having. And speaking of COVID-19, just the impact that it's having on training camp, preseason canceled, and from your perspective, what kind of impact we can see on some of these players. But Mason, glad to have you on, man.
Hey, glad to be on. Like you said, I've been listening for a while now. This is really exciting. And it's always one of those things, no matter what I'm listening to, whether it's, a Bears podcast, whether it's some of the sports talk radio, and they start talking about some of the injuries and things. And I'm sitting there at home or in my car and I'm like, you're not taking this into perspective. You need to bring this part in, with people calling in and asking, why is this player not in the field yet? So I'm glad I could add some of that, hopefully, expertise and help people understand why some of the things go the way they do.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. I'm going to try to lump some of these players in together. I think there are some common denominators that they do have, although you can definitely tell me I'm wrong because you're the expert here. But I do want to begin, I think, at the most important position on this team, which is quarterback. Both of the Bears quarterbacks suffered injuries last season. Nick Foles, of course, with this collarbone issue that was a re-injury to that collarbone, as well as Mitchell Trubisky with that shoulder dislocation. And I want to know just first and foremost your thoughts about the recovery for each, the impact that maybe it's had in their off seasons. Obviously, Mitch has been able to rehab more in the building, whereas Nick Foles hasn't really been around Halas Hall to kind of get in the building, and just curious to the impact that may have on him and just kind of the lay of the land. I know we're starting this open quarterback competition, and obviously last year's injuries, even though they may not be apparent right now, at least from a physical standpoint, they definitely have some sort of impact when it comes to how these two are going to go through this competition.
Yeah, absolutely. So normally when you're comparing the two, so for example, with Nick Foles, right, the more predominant injuries he's had have been those collarbone injuries he's had, the breaks, which has happened twice. And then with with Mitch, it tends to be a bit more of the soft tissue issue, dislocation of the shoulder, which you have the muscles and the ligaments that get disrupted. Traditionally, you're going to be a little bit more worried about the soft tissue issue. If someone comes into my clinic, it's much easier, in my opinion, for me to rehab a broken bone and the stuff around it versus some of that soft tissue. However, in this instance, it's actually kind of the opposite. Now, when you talk about like a collarbone break, it's actually kind of designed to break, actually. Really, the average load a clavicle or collarbone could take, it's about 1,500 newtons. And surprisingly enough, a 200-pound defensive back can tackle with up to about 1,600 newtons. So it's not surprising that occurs. And really, it's there to design so you don't break your neck. Something else breaks further down, that's not as important. Now, the problem with Nick is that he's had that happen twice now. And with that, it's now you start to think, okay, well, is there something a little more structurally that's different with him that's going to keep him out, and that why this keeps occurring? And something that a lot of people aren't taking into consideration long term with Nick is he had this occur last year when he was with the Jaguars. He had a rehab from that, came back for a short stint, and then again was relegated back to the bench again. So he wasn't really getting a lot of those first team reps for a while, right? He wasn't throwing the football quite as much. And then he hits an off season where it's a question mark of what he's even going to be doing. COVID hits, who knows what's going on. You get traded to the Bears, and you're still not going through those mechanics that you traditionally do. And now one of the things that I found was interesting at the very beginning of this offseason, he went on, Chase Daniel's podcast at one time, and they were talking about some of the rehab he was doing and some of the training he was doing. And the things he highlighted were actually things more like doing triathlon work. So he was doing a lot of swimming, a lot of running, and things like that. At the end of the day, that stuff's not necessarily going to help the shoulder in particular. And at the end of the day, it's all about muscle memory. It's all about that brain and muscle connection. If he doesn't have the chance to be throwing the football, throwing to NFL caliber wide receivers, he didn't have the defensive pass rush going against him like he would during the games of last season or even during off-season stuff. All that timing is really going to affect him. And at the end of the day, right, to take a line from a famous movie, it's a game of inches, So it's an inch difference in terms of that pass to Allen Robinson, whether it's an interception, a completion, or an incompletion. So then you look at Mitch, and normally, yes, a dislocation, that's something I'm going to worry a lot about because that shoulder, the way it's constructed, there's basically a vacuum with a labrum that sucks that shoulder into its socket. And as soon as you get a tear there, that vacuum is disrupted. And that can be very difficult to deal with. However, for him, it's on his non-throwing shoulder. So that's a huge benefit. With today, without having training camps as we normally do with the offseason programs, we're kind of stuck looking at social media and what they're doing in terms of their training. And with Mitch, if you actually look, he's been at Spear Fitness, and some of the things he's doing, it looks fantastic. Those are things that I would be having him do, and things that would make me confident that that shoulder is going to be strong. Just in terms of the complicated movements, making sure that the shoulder is moving in the way it should, things like that. Then you throw on top of that, lastly, that he has been, like you said, in Illinois. At the very beginning of all this stuff, he was able to be at the facilities rehabbing with the team. And you don't know exactly what's going on behind closed doors. I mean, is there a chance that he's also doing some stuff with teammates and things on the practice field inside? Sure, potentially, with some of those other guys that are rehabbing. And then he's out in the field throwing around with guys with Allen Robinson, with Cole Kmet, and that timing is going to be there, right? I mean, every time that Allen Robinson runs that slant, he's going to know exactly where Allen Robinson is, and it's going to look better on the field than with Foles having to kind of figure out what that timing is.
Right. Actually, really quick aside, I don't have this in my notes, but you're talking about with Mitch and his injury. Now, of course, he had that shoulder dislocated really early last season, and he had to wear a harness. And I know that wasn't on his throwing shoulder, but a lot of issues with Mitch last year were his throwing mechanics. Could a dislocation to that non-throwing shoulder kind of throw off that body kind of, I'll call it balance, as he was going through his mechanics and his motions?
Oh, absolutely. Like I was saying, so much of this is that muscle memory, and it's just being able to do the same thing over and over again. Now, all of a sudden, you have something that is, just sitting on you differently, that is tugging you in a way. And even though you're throwing with the right side, that the other side, the clavicle has to rotate differently. The shoulder blade on the other side has to work differently, and that matters all up and down the body. So that was something that he was having to work with all last season. That's going to be part of the reason why his passes were sailing at times. And then, of course, that's also going to be why he wasn't feeling comfortable running the ball too, right? Just whether it's the fear of getting hurt again, or just a different feeling in that pocket. So the hope is that with what he's been doing this offseason, that he wouldn't have to wear that shoulder brace. And if he does, it would have to be held loosely on there, just more as a precautionary thing, not actually holding it in place like it had to do all last season.
Sure. Exactly. I've had my shoulder dislocated. I don't know if about 6 times as my left shoulder. And I had a hard time even having trust sleeping on that side sometimes, because when the muscles would relax in my sleep, I've had it actually dislocate. So I couldn't imagine being a quarterback trying to run the ball with a linebacker trailing you, taking a hit, because I had a hard time trusting even sleeping on a mattress. So right. It definitely, I think, trust, like you just mentioned, is a bigger factor when it comes to shoulders. I know you talked to Nick about Jalen Johnson and his previous shoulder injuries, and we have a pretty good understanding of where you stand there. I don't mind if you want to talk about Johnson, but I think a bigger one for Bears fans right now is Anthony Miller, just due to the shoulder injuries that he's had throughout his career. I know he had the dislocation his rookie year, and then last year re-injured that same shoulder. And I believe it was listed as like an AC joint sprain. I know he had to get surgery on it again. Is this a shoulder that you are concerned about, maybe even a little bit more so than Mitch?
Oh, yes, absolutely. With him, right, whenever you talk about wide receiver, the range of motion that you need in those shoulders in order to make some of those catches, those contested catches, it's huge. And the fact that he's had it occur so often, and he talked about it during the season at times even, right, about how he was constantly adjusting the brace and trying to loosen it a little bit over time so that he could get a bigger catch radius. But then when he would loosen it, one game would come up where all of a sudden, boom, he dislocated again. And so with him, if you had to kind of put him in categories, he'd be a red flag for me that I would be concerned without actually having looked at him, without seeing exactly his rehab process, that he's going to potentially be dislocating that shoulder again at some point this season. And if he's not, it's because his brace is on in a way that his catch radius is going to be reduced into a significant extent, that if the passes aren't accurate enough, he may not be able to come down with that ball.
Yeah, that's also an issue, right? Like even if his shoulder is protected, his overall mobility being limited is going to hinder his impact, which is unfortunate because he does have a lot of talent. But injuries do play a role in that one. I did want to talk about both of the inside linebackers for the Chicago Bears as well because they're both coming off of pretty severe injuries. Trevathan had that a real gnarly elbow dislocation, and then Roquan Smith towards the end of last season tore his pectoral muscle. And now, of course, with Roquan, you're seeing him on Instagram, you're seeing him on social media. He's looking like he's living life and enjoying himself, and looks like he's pretty healthy for the most part. But between the two, are you more concerned about one over the other?
If I had to choose one that I was more concerned about, it would probably be Trevathan, to be quite honest. As you start to get, his was more of a freak accident, just how he landed on that arm, that elbow dislocation, and potentially a little bit of the bony damage that was done there. So it's not like it's something that would be recurrent, like the shoulder dislocations we just talked about with Anthony Miller. However, as when you start to talk about someone that is getting a little older in age, and that it's when you have something like that, I wouldn't even be maybe as concerned about another elbow dislocation, but something else in the chain. So maybe it's now something now in his shoulder, something with his neck, because he's had to do the recovery this offseason. And at the end of the day, he probably could have come back if the Bears had made the playoffs. He had the dislocation on November 10th and wasn't placed on IR until, I believe, December 18th. And that was after the Bears had been officially eliminated essentially from the playoffs. So they were ready to put him back out there. But at the same time, like I said, with his age getting up there, with where the injury was and the position he plays, right? It's a very forward position. You're always driving down towards the ball with a 200 some pound running back sprinting at you in the hole, or a large guard pulling and trying to get you. I would be more concerned more in that shoulder, neck, back area, if anything. When it comes to Roquan, again, there's actually not that common to have a pec injury, to be quite honest. There were over 15 seasons, there are only about 211 pec injuries. Of these, 132 were strains and 79 were ruptures. So, and with the ruptures, those are the ones you tend to do more surgery on. Most players come back in approximately 146-ish days on the high end for the most part. And so we're well past that. So he should be good for camp, good to go. Again, with him, with the best we can tell is with social media stuff. Like, what are you doing? Are you doing enough to rehab, or are you just going out and living your best life? Hard to say. We'll have to wait until training camp to see how he's moving around. But for the most part, I think he should be pretty good as long as he was sticking to his rehab.
Yeah, we've seen a little bit more of the off the rehab when it comes to Roquan, so maybe that is the bigger question, right? If he's sticking with it, but he looks strong. He looks like he's pretty well back into shape, which is good. And like he said, hopefully that's the case. Now, Akeem Hicks, he also had an elbow injury last year, and you can tell me if you think they rushed him back in maybe a little bit too soon. I think the results were pretty obvious in that regard, but is he in probably the same category as a Danny Trevathan, just due to the age, due to the nature of the injury, and the other impacts it can have?
I would say so. Right. And when it comes to football, there's a difference between being hurt and being injured. And that's what they always say. You have to figure out where that person falls. He was, Akeem Hicks from in terms of what he says and the tenacity he has. They couldn't have held him off the field if they wanted to. He was going to get back in there. Probably went in a bit too early. But yes, when you have someone that's that large, that big of a human being, and they're smashing against other people who are also that large, that's kind of where you start to fall into the question of injury prevention versus injury reduction. If someone comes to you and says, I can prevent the chance of you getting injured in a football game, they're lying to you. There's just so many factors that occur. That's a perfect example in that play where just the worst case scenario of people flying by, hitting the elbow at the right angle that resulted in the injury that he had. And it's an arduous recovery. He was just, a month out, and he was talking about how he was using 2-pound dumbbells to do his curls with, right? That's not the kind of weight you want to hear your defensive tackle talking like he's slinging around. Again, though, he'll probably be wearing a brace, I'm going to imagine, still once he gets back on the field. He's going to be full bore. He's going to be the old Akeem Hicks. The question really boils down to more, okay, what about the other areas? So, right, because of the fact that he was in a brace or a sling for that elbow for a period of time, were the people that were rehabbing him worried about, okay, well, let's keep your shoulder strong. Let's keep the shoulder range of motion going, right? Let's keep that core activation where it should be. So that and that's the question for most of these guys as they're coming back into camp now, they had no control over what they were doing. But you got to hope that they were, putting the work in, and they were working on not just the areas that they felt were problems, in his case, the elbow, but the areas around it that may have fallen to the wayside.
If you were an executive or a head coach, or heck, even like a head trainer for a team, would you be concerned about some of these guys who are coming back from injury since they did have to rehab away from your care, away from your facilities? You can send out all of your recommendations that you want, but if they're working with other medical professionals, they're going to have their own ways of going about it. So if you were in, say, Halas Hall, and these players are now just coming back for camp, would you be, I want to use the word skeptical, but just maybe a little cautious with them and seeing where they're at right now physically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would have to be very cautious as I'm bringing these guys in, and I mean, we'll get to it eventually in terms of that training camp schedule as what it's going to look like. But that ramp up period, that making sure that guys are ready for the rigors of a training camp and then the rigors of a full out football game, I would be monitoring very closely how my guys felt the whole time, because at the end of the day, it's all about training specificity, and unfortunately, when you're out training on your own, you can't train like you would in a training camp, right? The intensity is not going to be the same. You're not going to have the hits like you would, from player to player. You're not going to have the same fatigue. You're not going to have the same or anything like that. So therefore, you know that you're coming in behind the eight ball a little bit, regardless of how hard that these workers were. I would really hope that they did the best they could to vet the people that they were working with. But at the end of the day, some of these guys were in totally different states, right? They're picking their old high school trainers, their old college trainers. And unfortunately, some of the strategies used may not be what they wanted in terms of an off season for their players.
Is there any other players that you wanted to kind of hit on that you think the injuries were large enough last year that do warrant some concern or consideration heading into the season? I know some bigger names like Bilal Nichols, Bobby Massey. I did brush over Jalen Johnson quick just because I think with his shoulders, it's probably along the lines of an Anthony Miller. So I think they're similar. Again, you can tell me if I'm wrong, sir. But I just want to make sure there aren't any other players that you did want to discuss today.
Yeah. I would hit real quick on Jalen Johnson. I mean, his shoulder surgery, because the one he got, it's a little bit more of a rare surgery. Doesn't happen that often. But with him, it's going to be more of a long-term issue. They've actually seen that there are some hardware complications and some changes on x-rays that they've seen. But that's going to be something like 3-4 years down the road that all of a sudden it's like, okay, his shoulder's starting to get real sore more often. It's not something that's going to be as relevant for this training camp this year. When you think about someone like a Bilal Nichols, he had that handbrake. Most upper extremity, and when it comes to the NFL, is more of that worst case scenario, bad, wrong place, wrong time scenario. For him, if anything, I would be more thinking about that knee injury he had the previous year. So now at the end of the day, right, same concept as when you talk about Nakeem Hicks, very large individual smashing against other very large individuals. And the thing that needs to be taken into account is now Eddie Goldman not being there. And actually, as we just also found out, John Jenkins not being there for the beginning of it, at least, because he's on that designation as well. So Bilal Nichols does not play the same position as Eddie Goldman. But it's interesting when you listen to the press conference that they had, and Pace started listing the individuals that need to step up with Eddie Goldman not being there. Bilal Nichols was like the second person they listed after Nakeem Hicks. When it comes to on the football field, you aren't necessarily going to lean as much on that second, third level backup. If anything, you're going to ask some of your other starters to potentially do a little bit more, right? Do some more stunts. Maybe he's asking him to take on some more double teams, because what Eddie Goldman did so well was sit in the middle and just get smashed by two guys. And so is that something that Bilal Nichols is ready for? Is he ready to take on more snaps, to take on potentially more double teams? And is that knee going to be able to hold him? Because we saw that it was an issue 2 years ago. And we saw that, yes, his snaps were down this year than due to the hand. But if he didn't have those snap reductions, could he have had some of that knee pain come back on him? And then lastly, Bobby Massey. The high ankle sprain is always so tough. It's a rough injury, right? Because you have that talus, that ankle bone that gets shoved straight up into the two other bones, and you're just basically tearing that connective tissue in between. Again, once you have these big guys that are trying to move around on it, every step you take, that bone gets shoved up a little bit higher. Normally it takes 6 weeks to about 3 months, depending on the person, to recover. So he's going to be fine for training camp in terms of actually going. But at the end of the day, like, again, a little bit on the older side. A lot of weight that he's moving around. He's going to be going against some very athletic, defensive ends that are going to be rushing on him. I don't necessarily think that he's going to have another injury. However, his performance may not be necessarily as high as we want it to be.
Okay, let's go ahead and kind of segue into our next couple of talking points here, which is going to be the impact that COVID-19 is having on training camp. I think the largest change here is going to be the lack of preseason. And I know you and I were talking as we're just kind of discussing a couple ways to take this conversation. And you're talking about the lack of, I think you called it high impact reps, and the lack of those and what the impact may end up being. So can you explain why maybe not having joint practices, preseason games, as much as maybe those may bore some fans to watch, which myself included, depending on the game, as long as it's anyone but the Chicago Bears, but really the loss of those reps and what that could mean in terms of a health standpoint, a stability standpoint, and just curious your thoughts.
Yeah. So when it comes to that, you can really look at ability to reduce chances of injury due to two main pathways, right? You have your traditional strength and what you think about with that, but then you're also going to have that neuromuscular control thought process. So, for example, if you're a running back and you go to hit the hole, someone comes, dives at your legs, and hits you on the outside of your knee. Does your body have the control, that neuromuscular control, to be able to allow the knee to bend in enough to protect it, but not so much that all of a sudden that you're going to have a tear of an ACL or a break of a bone? And the only way that your body learns to do those things is essentially by doing it, right? So by having those hitting practices where you're doing hitting drills in camp, where you're having to make those last second cuts because now all of a sudden the angle's a little different than what you were practicing at home with your cones, because you don't have a defender all of a sudden crashing down on you, and you have to make these last second adjustments. Does your body have the ability to say, okay, I need to now let my knee fall in this much and push off with this much effort in order to now hit this hole? So there's certainly a higher chance without having these joint practices, without having these offseason, and without just having the traditional mini camps, that the bodies aren't necessarily ready to take those kinds of loads on. And something that was talked about a little bit in actually that most recent press conference were some of these rookies and some of these people pushing too hard, right? Some of these that guys saying, well, I need to make up for lost time, or this is the only opportunity I have, or things of that nature. And now all of a sudden you have a sore back and you're saying, well, no, I can't leave practice. I can't get the work that I need to get done in order to make myself feel better, because if I leave practice, I'm losing important reps and potentially losing position on the depth chart. And so now these guys are going out there in a hurt position, trying to do a little bit too much.
Now, I know the NFL is trying their best here as they're going through some of the changes with training camp. I would say the largest change with training camp, of course, is this gradual ramp-up period that they are implementing. Really, you're not going to get any players even having padded practice until, I think, August 17th. I know their thought process here is looking at the 2011 lockout season. They had all those soft tissue injuries, so they're trying to implement this ramp-up period. Do you think they're on the right track with how they're going about this to try to limit some of those soft tissue injuries, or do you think more should have been done? Just real curious about your perspective.
So they're doing the right thing. The ramp-up period is imperative in this situation. So not only about approximately 8 days that they're doing just that strength and conditioning walkthrough-esque stuff, but also those other kind of modified days as they're getting into it. The only thing that's unfortunate is it may not be necessarily enough. It's better than nothing, of course. Mm-hmm. However, you see that to get true changes in things like strength and conditioning, you need about 6 to 8 weeks of continuous progressive strength training to get muscular gains. Same thing can be said about VO2 max, or basically your body's capacity to, have that aerobic capacity, endurance training, things like that. That still also takes about that 6 to 8 week mark. So the good thing is there's a big difference between trained and non-trained individuals. So if you or I were all of a sudden go out there, it's going to take us much longer to get to that point where we be safe, versus some of these individuals where these trained individuals, it's going to take them a little bit shorter period of time. So that's a positive thing. There is still, with that though, where I still think we're going to see an uptick in some of those soft tissue injuries during training camp. But then actually some of the bigger things that you're potentially going to see is actually more probably like, if we get to that point, heaven forbid something happens in the season, more like week 6, week 7, when all those things really start to layer on. A good example being if you go back to with Khalil Mack, right? He didn't really have the training camp, the offseason that he was supposed to have because of the issues with the contract and being traded to the Bears. He comes in, he's killing it, he's doing awesome, and then all of a sudden there's this ankle injury in the Dolphins game, and he's never really quite the same since then. Now we can't say for sure would he not have injured his ankle if he had that offseason, but it's more likely that he would have been okay then because there were just too many reps there. I mean, they tried even controlling his, but eventually you're not going to keep Khalil Mack off the field. You gotta get him out there.
Do you think that since they're cutting the roster down to the 80 guys too, that they're getting some of these extra reps in practice will lead to some of this overwork as well?
Yes. So at the end of the day now, right, it's going to be a situation of two things. One, the fact that there's just less people, so therefore less reps to do, less breaks on the side, less recovery. And then ultimately, secondarily with that, when you're now trying to do the social distancing aspect, is there going to be a difference where, okay, we have our, defensive line over here, and normally we might pull a couple of extra guys from maybe some other positions that we're kind of doing a cross position thing, but now we can't do that. It's just these guys we have right here. And so therefore that social distancing aspect might make it a little harder to spread those reps out as well. There are a lot of really good studies out there that are using GPS technology where they're tracking players' training essentially and their work output. And they're finding that once you hit a certain threshold with that work output, the chance of injury does go up. And that's more or less kind of like the GPS stuff that they're using for their social distancing at Halas Hall, if anyone had a chance to hear about that. But yes, that at the end of the day, cutting that down, it's nice that they're expanding the practice squad. That's going to make it a little easier on the season, just to keep some of those guys ready for once the games actually start. But it is a shame that they had to reduce the number of bodies that they had at training camp.
Absolutely. You kind of led into my next segment here. I know earlier in the show, Nick and I, we talked about some of the changes that the Bears are doing just due to COVID-19 and how they're adapting Halas Hall. Just curious to any of the thoughts that you may have on this as well. I mean, I have you on here, so I would be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to share some of your thoughts and input as well.
And I think they're doing a great job. It's such an in-depth process that they're going through in terms of, have to screen yourself at home first. And then, you can't get into the building if you don't meet those certain requirements. And then, it's going to be frustrating for the players. It's going to be frustrating for the coaches. And if anything, it's going to be a mental fatigue thing, like having to do that all day, every day. But, it's similar to the NBA bubble where I would personally feel, if anything, safer doing that and being, at training camp than I would be even in real life. These guys are going to get screened every day. If they see someone that doesn't, or that has, their temperature is off, that they tested positive, like I said, they have that GPS technology where they're going to say, you were around these 8 players. All right, let's take you and those 8 players, remove you guys from the group, test you guys again and make sure that potentially something doesn't spread. I mean, it's safer, honestly, to be there than it's going to be just going to the local grocery store. We have no idea what the
You're
heck
not wrong.
People are doing. And then you walk by someone going down a hallway and they got they're not wearing their mask, that whole thing. So I would feel pretty confident in what the Bears are doing. And this is a learning process, like we've never done this before. We have to, and we're going to unfortunately have to learn from our mistakes. And if there's something that's off, they're going to fix it.
You're right. It's never going to be a perfect system. I think we've learned that throughout 2020. It's just one of those where we just have to gradually get better with each passing day and learning from what went well, what did not go well, and just don't be stubborn and stick with the status quo just because we all need to protect one another. But Mason, is there anything else that you wanted to hit on, either with the Bears, specifically training camp, lack of a preseason? I think we hit on the injuries part pretty well earlier in your segment, but just want to make sure that there isn't anything else in your notes that you prepared for that you want to make sure Bears fans know about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that people are really harping on, or at least that I've seen it with some of the stuff on Twitter and things like that, is a little bit of the, Andre Tucker had talked about how they will have the masks available for the actual helmets and everything. However, it's going to be optional. You don't have to wear it. And then if I recall correctly, Matt Nagy had gone on and said, but when you're in the building, you have to wear the mask. It is one of those things where they're going through the process. They're screening these guys. They're making sure that they don't have the symptoms and all this stuff. And again, you're taking them and now you're shoving them into a training camp where they're going to be doing intense athletic stuff that, if at the end of the day, if they've screened that they're not in the realm of risk and they choose not to wear their special, helmet mask, that, again, that situation is probably safer than it is for most other people. And to keep in mind the toll that, honestly, if anyone's ever played football in August in Chicago, they know what it's like to have that helmet and pads on. So now adding that extra masks on the front is going to be very difficult. So just keeping in mind that even if someone chooses not to wear it, it's not necessarily, going to be a huge detriment to them or anyone around them. They're doing everything else that they really should be doing to make sure people are going to be safe.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mason. Hopefully you have yourself a good rest of your week and enjoying getting what little content we're going to be able to get out of the Bears training camp, with not just the restrictions with players and coaches, but with the media themselves. And I'm excited for this season if we can get there. And I just want to thank you again for your time and, of course, for your support of the podcast over the years.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on. It was, a lot of fun. And like you said, hopefully there's more football to talk about.
All right, Nick. So obviously Mason brought some really good insight to the table here, and I hope that listeners of the show were able to take that information, found it to be as insightful as I did, and you as well. But just a couple small points to kind of just wrap up the show here. I know we hit on the quarterbacks hard, just because A, it's the most exciting and biggest talking point so far this offseason, and B, it's a little bit more fresh in our minds. But the Bears did have Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy speak to the media earlier, and they, of course, had their own tidbits to share that I think we should discuss. And for me, one of the bigger ones, which even though they said it, and we'll discuss it because they said it, it's just an obvious thing, and that's just about the rookies, how they're a little bit behind just due to the offseason, and the Bears are trying their best to catch them up, but there's going to be an impact in terms of like limited reps, and it may take them a while this season to get up to speed, to get up to snuff. So I'm curious to your thoughts about how it could impact this rookie class, specifically, probably most importantly, Jalen Johnson and Cole Kmet, as well as the mid to late round guys. Because personally, I think Kmet, he has to be everything the Bears wanted him to be, off-season or not. He needs to find a way to be that wide tight end in this roster. And then secondly, Jalen Johnson, I still think I know there are a couple of options, but I think he, for the Bears' sake, needs to win this cornerback competition. Again, offseason or not, I don't really care. He needs to find a way to get it done. Do you think that both of them, even though they're maybe a little bit behind compared to previous rookie classes, do have what it takes to still have those roles, especially early on the season that we were all envisioning maybe around draft time?
Yeah, I believe so, Will. Another thing that was mentioned on the Hogan Johns podcast, one of the Adams asked Pace about this rookie class, and again, a lot of similar things with the COVID-19 pandemic, how it affects them. And Pace was saying that the football IQ amongst all the draft picks is a strength of this rookie class. They're all just really sharp guys, can pick up on things. We've already heard Matt Nagy just, again, flourish about Cole Kmet's ability to pick up this offense and run it effectively and just knowing what to do on specific plays. But I think what also, again, having these limited reps and all these things like that, it does create the competition at that cornerback position to be a little bit more profound, I think. I thought, when the Bears drafted Jalen Johnson, number 1 day starter come week 1. But Pace was saying that this is a position battle that he's going to be really looking at. There's someone that's, I think it was underrated. What's a position battle that's underrated that you guys aren't talking about as much? Nagy and Pace both said cornerback. And I think, look, maybe even if this all wasn't happening, that still would be a position battle, but maybe just those limited reps and things just makes it that much more of a competition. But I think this rookie class, there's a lot of veterans in front of them at their specific positions that are going to help them in this process. And we already talked earlier in the podcast about what Mitch, Nick Foles, and Tyler Bray are doing for this rookie class in terms of the offensive players and trying to learn this offense. So it's nice to hear that the strength is they're all sharp. Football IQ is a plus with all these guys. And, of course, it's going to impact them not having the actual practice reps and things of that nature. But I think they're in good hands with the people they have there, not just the teammates, but just the staff members and all those pieces in place. The Bears have a good, tight-knit organization, great culture, so anybody new coming to it, even in these times, can learn and get the best out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I thought we did a good job of covering that cornerback competition. We had a show dedicated to it. We've mentioned it a few times, so I guess the media needs to catch up to the battle at CB. But What about the mid-round guys like Gibson and Mooney? Because those are probably the guys where they would have smaller roles anyway. So I'm curious, do you think they'll have an impact on them early on this season? Just because they're not guys that we envision starting. I mean, especially Gibson, especially Mooney. Okay, both of them. So for the fact that they're not really expected to start, they're expected to have like a role this year. Do you think they'll be as impacted or have their work cut out to them as much, or do you think they'll have it? I'll say a little bit easier. That may not be the right phrase here, but maybe there's a little bit less pressure on them to get all the way up to speed by week 1.
Yeah, I think with them, we weren't, like you were saying, Will, anticipating them being the biggest contributors from the get-go. And look, I would think it would be crazy for me to say that COVID-19 isn't going to affect them because this isn't your typical football season. They would have had a lot more work, just been around the facility more than they have been, which is unfortunate, but that's just a situation that they're in, something that Nick Foles kept on reiterating. That's a situation we're in. So, yeah, I think it definitely impacts them, but going back to my point just a couple seconds ago, those guys definitely have some great veterans in front of them. We said Ted Ginn Jr. is perfect for a guy like Darnell Mooney. Same, very similar position, someone that you can definitely learn from, and obviously Gibson has Quinn and Mack to kind of learn from as well. So those are great guys to have. But, yeah, COVID, it's going to impact, I think, what they would have been able to do. And in terms of playing time in the beginning of the season, I wasn't really anticipating much, but it probably does hinder it a little bit, to be completely honest. And again, they're in this good situation. They'll learn from these veterans and from just the people around them how to best cope with this and get the most out of it.
Yeah, really well said, man. Moving on to the next topic, let's talk about a positive one next I see here in my notes, and that's about Allen Robinson. I think if you listen to Ryan Pace this week and you read between the lines and you read everything that Allen Robinson's been on social media about, I believe it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of when they want to make that extension rather than if, which I believe it just makes too much sense. Like if you just let him walk, I think that's a huge mistake. But it just seems like they're waiting for the right time to execute the deal and get it done. And I know, Nick, you and I were talking about it. Could have been the last podcast. It could have been, I think, the wide receiver episode specifically. Just it's going to be in September, more than likely, just looking at the timing of recent extensions in the past. Did that kind of confirm your gut feeling there?
Yeah, and Pace was saying, again, on that Hogan Johns podcast, that they're usually pretty quiet about these situations, and they are. They're not going to say they're going to extend somebody or release that information, but he also mentioned how important Allen Robinson is to this offense and to the culture that they have in Chicago. But I have a gut feeling, or a good feeling too, at that come September, first week, right before maybe that week 1 of the season, we'll see what we should have saw in the beginning, right? But Allen Robinson, I have a good feeling we'll get that extension because, like we said, I think we didn't even do it though, Will, like a confidence meter with and without Allen Robinson. Had we done that, so yeah, I think we forgot to do that, but they know how important he is to this offense, so there's no way that I don't see this deal getting done.
Well, that's sad. I remember wanting to do that, and I didn't add it to the notes on the fly, which I should have. Let's just say that both of our confidence would have been shot without.
Yeah, there you go.
I think it goes without saying, so I guess it's okay. But, yeah, Allen Robinson, hopefully that all comes to fruition. But any other extras from Pace and Nagy? Again, it was just a lot of coach speak, front office speak, and I'm not going to just rehash, every little thing they said because they're going to talk themselves up and can't focus on last year. We have to focus on this year, the same old adage that you're going to hear from every team ever. But I did like how Matt Nagy mentioned that he wants to find ways to keep camp physical, and they're going to be a tough football team that may still toe the line of those same old sayings that you're going to hear from coaches, but with the limited training camp, without a preseason, as we learned from Mason, like they do need to find a way to get those high impact reps to put in there so the body does get calloused. The muscles do have that memory of knowing how to handle contact once they get into a full 100% speed game situation. So I do like hearing that they're keeping that in mind and they're going to find ways to keep this training camp as physical as they can given the limitations. Is there anything else? Did you want to build on that, or is there anything else from Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy that you want to make sure that, just in case our listeners, like me, have been working like a dog all week and haven't been able to sit down and listen to the full, hour-long interview with both of them, that they make sure that they know of heading into this week 2 of Bears camp?
Yeah, so this one's actually going to, again, referencing the Hogan Johns podcast because they had Ryan Pace for almost 50 minutes of audio there. But they asked him about Cam Newton. Just, again, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what Pace had to say about this situation because that was a huge talking point. Mm-hmm. What were they going to do in about March with the quarterback situation? Of course, Pace didn't really say too much, but he did say that there were just a lot of options that the Bears looked at, and they explored all of them. And they were very thorough with the process, and they went through all of them. So I think at some point in time, it would be safe to say that the Bears maybe did think about a Cam Newton, but with that foot situation, I think you couldn't bring him in at that point in time to your facility because that's when COVID was really just starting, and you had to be really careful of what you could and couldn't do. So that's what was mentioned. That's what Pace said about that. And then one last thing that was also mentioned in that podcast, they talked about Jay Rodgers, the Bears defensive line coach, and the importance he now has with Eddie Goldman out and obviously Jenkins being on the COVID-19 reserve list. They say Pace was saying that Rodgers does such a good job of just maximizing the talent from his group and also recognizing the limitations. So what was mentioned was that he focuses, yes, on what those limitations are, but tries to put each guy in a scenario where he's just going to maximize his talent. So then you're kind of mitigating what he does or doesn't do well. So, and he's good at adapting, which every single coach really needs to be able to do, especially during these times. But those are really the only other takeaways from either Nagy, Pace that I kind of wanted to mention here.
You don't want to talk about the Bears having high confidence in the running back depth because the key word there is depth, and that is one that last week or a week and a half ago we were a little skeptical of because you have Montgomery and then you have Cohen and then you have a mixture of Cordero Patterson, but you don't have that next guy who could be a 3-down back, who is that traditional running back like a David Montgomery right now. Now they have a couple undrafted free agents that they can look into. That, of course, I believe Pierce is also on the COVID-19 reserve list right now, who is the one that I was higher on, so that's unfortunate for him. But the fact that they went out of their way to say that they are confident in the depth, they even mentioned Ryan Nall's name, which I guess it's about August now, so it makes sense that you want to talk up Ryan Nall, but I don't know. That one just took me by surprise, and it felt like, I don't know, like why would you say that? Because just looking at the roster, I don't see how you could be confident. Again, they're going to talk up their own team because they don't want to say, yeah, we neglected to really put some depth at running back. They're not going to say it, but I'm not going to buy that they are confident in the depth at the position just because really they don't have depth there. Now, do you like David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen as options? Sure. Do you like Cordero Patterson as well as another, potential playmaker back there in the backfield? Great. Do you like Ryan Nall? Well, then we're going to have a different discussion. But outside of that, I don't understand why you would have confidence in the depth. You just have unproven rookies that weren't drafted, which, again, running backs, you hear the saying, dime a dozen, so you can find one. But still, it's a little confusing. That's the word I'll just mention is confusing. But you didn't want to mention that, Nick, huh?
I completely forgot about looking at my notes, I'm like, why am I not seeing these bullet points that we're obviously talking about right now on my sheet here? I'm like, I think I just may have made 2 of them and just expanded on the newest one and forgot some of the other talking points because I specifically remember running backs. We talked about this. We were going to mention this, and I think I was the one that reminded you, but you reminded me just now of it. But it is interesting to hear them kind of word it that way, that they do feel this confidence in this running back position. I think the reporter actually asked, again, he mentioned specifically about Cordero Patterson. Where is he taking most of the reps at? Of course, Pace just blows by the answer, doesn't address it. Is that an indication that maybe it is going to be a little bit more running backs? Because in training camp last year, it was both. It was like you'd see Patterson with the wide receivers, see him with the running backs. So maybe that's a way of saying it by not saying it. But it is interesting because if you take David Montgomery out of this, and a lot of teams you take out their number 1 running back, they'd be in a bad situation.
Right.
Well, the Bears would be in a very bad situation. You can't have Tariq Cohen be that guy. Then we would all see Ryan Nall. We would have to see Ryan Nall if that was the case. But they don't have a lot of depth. and they're probably talking up their guys because they do feel confident in them. And everyone knows I like David Montgomery, but they can definitely add another guy there, and I'd feel way better about the situation than what they have right now.
It's not that I don't believe that one of these undrafted backs could be a potential option. It's just that you can't. I would be silly if I've never seen them on a practice field in the NFL, in a training camp, in an NFL game. They're like, yeah, they'll be fine. Like, you don't know. It's just, and they don't either. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, they may have, they've done walkthroughs so far? So they don't know either. And Pierce is on the reserve list, so you're down to one option. So it's, unless they really, really internally like Ryan Nall, which would be really, really confusing. Well, that's the only way I can see it. But it's just that's why this point of the year, you take everything what they say, you look at it through their perspective, and you just understand, like, you're going to hear these things, you're going to say these things, but it's a matter of finding the right things to buy into, which I think with a lot of what we talked about with Mitch specifically, I buy into that he's been putting in the work and he's elevated his game. Now we'll find out how much and if he can handle that inside of a game. But in terms of the other things like a running back, you're going to just say, maybe not so much, which that's what training camp's all about. Any final thoughts about either anything that we discussed so far, Nick, or anything that we have forgotten about throughout this week that you want to make sure our listeners know?
Not really, Will, but it is nice that we have talking points again. We were just saying, like, a week ago, what are we going to talk about? And we had so much to talk about just within a week of time of us saying that. So hopefully that continues as we can continue to find just valuable information to display to you guys, to, again, make you the most informed Bears fans, because that is what we strive to do, and that is what our goal is each and every podcast, each and every season, each and every episode. So it was fun to talk about a bunch of Bears talking points, and the Bears are at Halas Hall. They're kind of in a training camp. Not really. It's weird to say that, but they are. And they're getting work on the field, and we'll see them in pads, I think, around August 17th, and that's when it'll become even more real. But I'm enjoying this for now. We do have some, like you mentioned, basketball earlier. There's live sports on again. It's nice to have that again and what we've all just been going through. So, yeah, I'm going to enjoy this for sure.
Well, hopefully they play some defense if I watch another game. I don't watch a lot of NBA basketball, but it was on last night after I came home from my middle school practice, and I was just going through some notes on some players I took, and the game's on, and my son, he's huge into basketball. Like, he loves, like, he's 7 years old, and he's like, I was like, who's your favorite player? He's like, today it's Vince Carter. I'm like, who are you? Are you like a 30-year-old man in that body? But, yeah, he loves Vince Carter and Shaquille O'Neal and Magic Johnson, which, for being 7 years old, and he finds these players himself and, like, learns about them, it's pretty remarkable. But just watching that game, like, you look up and it's like halftime, and, like, each team had about 80 points. And I'm like, this is wrong. And I'm hopeful that the NFL won't be the same way. Because if so, like, if it really tarnishes the level of play to that degree, if we're getting 35 points scored by each team in the first half, like, as much as I love watching football, like, that wouldn't feel right. That would feel like a shell of what we would expect from a season.
Unless the Bears are scoring 35 points a game.
I'm saying each team, like, if you have 70 points total scored in a half, because no defense is being played, that would just be, ugh.
Yeah, no. I think what's good, though, like with this situation, usually defenses come along a little bit quicker and faster, even, I think, during these times. If anything, it might be the exact opposite, where we're just not seeing any scoring whatsoever. But if it did somehow go the way of the NBA, where no defense is being played, I think the Houston Rockets were the team that you maybe were watching. Yeah, of course, they don't play defense. But, yeah, that'd be insane.
That's probably the most basketball talk we've ever had in this podcast, which is great because it's not even remotely in our atmosphere that we want to discuss. But you have to look at some other sports right now and how they're coming back and what's happening, and to kind of gauge what may be the NFL's reality for 2020. And like I said, I was thinking about that last night. Like, hey, hopefully it's a little bit more stern with the defense. But if it's just the Houston Rockets, great. But I don't know. I don't know. But all right, Nick, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I know that it is unfortunate that Nick and I can't be there at Halas Hall. We can't ask players or coaches some questions here on Zoom to get some of our questions answered, but we're trying our best I wish we can be at training camp. Like right now, it's like usually I'm living at Nick's house, and we're waking up at the crack ass of dawn, and we're driving to Bourbonnais, and we're doing a live show right there on the campus, and then we head back, and we're supposed to get some king crab here, and it's just not the year that we thought about. But it's okay, and I'm glad that you're sticking with us. You're rolling here, but of course, when we all get to game time and we're all doing our post-game shows and our game previews, like I'm really excited to get to that point here, and we're only about a month and a couple weeks away from that, so hang in there. We can all do this together. Again, it's going to be a really dark August, but get what you can, get the information you can, just stay engaged, stay interested, and the season will be here before you know it. Just like when we do Countdown to Camp. We do started in May, started the first week of June, and it feels like it's so long away, and we can push some of these episodes off, and then you're doing 3 positions in like 3 days. So it just happens really fast. But thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate everyone around the world for giving the show a listen, whether it's on a podcast player of your choice, here on YouTube, or just, again, anywhere in the world. If you're listening to us, we really do appreciate you. If you want to support the show, again, you can leave a small $5 donation on Venmo at the Chicago Audible. You'll see our logo as well as Nicholas Moriano's name. On PayPal, it's chicagoaudible.com/PayPal. And if you don't have any monetary ways of supporting the show, of course, we more than understand, and that's no problem at all. And if you've already reviewed our show, tell a friend. And if you haven't reviewed our show on Apple Podcasts yet, doing so is the second best way to help support our show, and we would appreciate a review. That's going to do it. You'll hear from us here, I'm expecting within another week, depending on how big of news trickles out of Halas Hall again, so we can continue to recap, making sure that you're not missing any of the most important details that the Bears do allow the public to know. And we'll just keep playing it by ear, which is the 2020 motto. So have a good rest of your week, and it is a weekend now, and bear down, Chicago. Bear down!